Hello, everybody. So this is the fourth talk in the series of what happens when we die, and the second on the question of, is rebirth true? So in this second talk on the truth or otherwise of rebirth and karma, I'm going to focus on three specific areas for consideration. Firstly, the phenomenon of tulkus or reincarnate lamas. Secondly, the scientific evidence for rebirth. And thirdly, near-death experiences. And as I've said many times already in this series, my aim is not to provide you with definite answers, but to point you in directions for reading and reflection that hopefully can help you to make up your own mind on the issue of rebirth and karma. So first of all, the tulku system. So one of the most well-known aspects of rebirth in Buddhism is the tulku system in Tibetan Buddhism. So in this system, when a prominent lama, such as the Dalai Lama, dies, a group of senior lamas convenes to find the young reincarnation, or tulku. And to find the tulku, they can employ a variety of methods. Maybe they find a letter left behind by the departed tulku indicating where he intends to be born again. Or they can inquire whether during his last days he gave any hints on where to find the new tulku. And sometimes they consult an oracle. And when they find a potential candidate, they look for behavioral signs that relate any potential candidate to the deceased tulku. And once they identify the tulku, that person is brought up inside a monastery under close supervision and is trained to take on their inherited role. So one of Sangharakshita's closest friends and teachers during his time in Kalimpong in India was Dharma Rinpoche, himself the 12th in line of a series of tulkus within the Gelugpa tradition of Tibetan Buddhism. Now, Dharma Rinpoche himself placed little value on reincarnation, although he says when he was a child, he did have some memories of a previous life. Nevertheless, he couldn't say for sure that he was the reincarnation of the previous tulku. But given his role within the Tibetan community, he thought he ought to act as if he was one by doing his best to cultivate wisdom and compassion. But in October 2019, coming closer to the present day, the American Buddhist magazine Lion's Roar reported that the Dalai Lama had said it may be time for the tradition of recognizing reincarnate lamas to come to an end. The Dalai Lama made this statement apparently in a meeting with students in northern India. And he said that the reincarnation system had never existed in India, and that there are no recognized reincarnations of great Indian Buddhist masters like Nagarjuna or the Buddha himself. And he went on, the system of recognizing reincarnate lamas or tulkus related to Tibetan feudal society. He questioned the existence of such a tradition in a democratic society. And he even said, apparently, that his own position as the Dalai Lama is linked to a feudal system, and maybe it should go. Now, whether the Tibetan Buddhist establishment agree with what he was saying is another matter entirely. And on other occasions, the Dalai Lama has taken somewhat different positions, saying, for example, that he would not be reborn in a Tibet ruled by China. But the Dalai Lama also pointed to instances where he said the system had been corrupted. by individual lamas who used the claim of reincarnation to enhance their reputation, but who never paid proper attention to study and wisdom. So there's a doubt there in the Dalai Lama's mind about the tulkus system. And I find it ironic that the institution that most vociferously insists that the system of reincarnated Dalai Lamas must continue is the strongly anti-religious Communist Party of China. They insist that the Dalai Lama must be reborn in Tibet, where he can be brought up under close supervision of a very different kind. So that's some thoughts for you on the tulkus system. Now on to scientific evidence for rebirth. So Jim Tucker and Ian Stevenson are researchers who have published many articles and major books on childhood memories of previous lives. Ian Stevenson was a well-respected academic who left his position as chair of psychiatry at the University of Virginia in the 1960s to undertake a full-time study of reincarnation. And though his papers never got published in any mainstream scientific journals, he did receive appreciative reviews in respected publications like the Journal of the American Medical Association, the American Journal of Psychology, and The Lancet. Before his death in 2007, Ian Stevenson handed over much of his work to Jim Tucker at the University of Virginia's Division of Perceptual Studies. And after decades of research, the Division of Perceptual Studies now houses 2,500 detailed records of children who have reported memories of past lives. Jim Tucker has written 3 books summarizing the research: Life Before Life, Return to Life, and Before: Children's Memories of Previous Lives. And in Life Before Life, Jim Tucker writes, the best explanation for the strongest cases is that memories, emotions, and even physical injuries can sometimes carry over from one life to the next. And Jim Tucker's research suggests that if rebirth is real, much more than memories pass from one life to the next. Many children have behaviors and emotions that seem closely related to their previous life. And it seems that exceptional positive attributes can also carry over. In almost 1 in 10 cases, parents report that their child has an unusual skill related to the previous life. Some of those cases involve xenoglossy, the ability to speak or write a language the child could not have learned by normal means. And in his book, Rebirth in Early Buddhism and Current Research, Bhikkhu Analayo, after reviewing the research evidence on individual cases collected by Tucker and Stevenson, concludes that fraud as an explanation for all of them can be, in his view, safely discarded, adding that the body of evidence collected offers considerable support for the assumption that at least some of these cases do reflect genuine memories of the past. And in his book, Rebirth in Early Buddhism and Current Research, Analayo tells a detailed story of a boy called Dhammaruwan, a Sri Lankan boy born in 1968. And at the age of 2, he spontaneously began to sit in meditation and chant in Pali for long stretches of time. And Analayo goes to great lengths to analyze the chants themselves to determine whether the child could have learned them by overhearing them in this life. And his book includes an exhaustive comparison of the discourses chanted by the child with 4 different editions of the Pali text from Sri Lanka, from Burma, from Thailand, and from London, establishing that Dhammaruwan's versions of the text are not to be found in any modern source. Therefore, Analayo concludes, the boy had no way of learning them in this current lifetime. And in his review of Analayo's book, Dharmachari Nagapriya of our Triratna Buddhist order writes this: the book does underline how rebirth has formed an integral part of Buddhist teaching and offers some evidence for those in need of it, which indicates that rebirth in some form or other is a credible belief. It also leaves many questions untouched, which relate to the nature of personal identity, continuity, and karmic legacy. I think what Nagapriya is pointing towards is that even if we accept the accounts of childhood memories of past lives, this does leave lots of questions unanswered and maybe doesn't provide conclusive proof of the truth of the doctrine of rebirth and karma. And Nagapriya finishes the review with these words. Analayo concludes by proposing that what remains of central importance is to learn to face our own mortality, one's own and that of others, rather than turn a blind eye to it. This requires us to practice mindfulness of death. This is an important and pragmatic reminder. All of us will die, whether or not we believe in rebirth, and this fact invites us to consider what our legacy will be. So that's some thoughts on scientific evidence and other evidence for rebirth. So now, thirdly, I want to turn to near-death experiences. So strictly speaking, near-death experiences are not pointers to the existence of rebirth, but if they are to be literally believed, they do point to some sort of continuing existence after the death of the body. And there's a lot written about near-death experiences, and you can find good video material about them in Adhisthana's Nature of Mind series, which is available on YouTube with Maitreya Bandhu and others. But there are 2 books that relate to near-death experiences that I'd like to mention because they have had a significant effect upon me. And the first book is difficult to simply summarize, but it has an extraordinary power. It's called In My Time of Dying by Sebastian Junger. It came out last year. He's a journalist and war reporter. His full title is In My Time of Dying: How Coming Close to Death Forced Me to Face the Idea of an Afterlife, something like that. He was a war reporter, but he's also famous for writing about lots of other issues. He's a very much been awarded for and recognized for his writing. But this book hinges on Sebastian Junger's vivid description of his personal near-death experience and leads him to an inquiry into the nature of existence and the afterlife. It's a major contemplation of whether his near-death vision was a product simply of brain chemistry or indicative of something beyond our current understanding. I can't recommend the book too highly. It's wonderfully written and very moving, even when dealing with technical descriptions of the workings of the brain. And I'm going to read out an excerpt from the book. So he's been taken from his home to hospital. He's in America, and he's close to death. The doctors can't figure out what's wrong with him, but they know he's dying. And he's on a gurney in the operating theatre. He's still conscious. They haven't put him out under anesthetic yet. And this is his description. Dr. Wilson seemed to be taking a long time getting the cordis line into my jugular. And while he worked, I became aware of a dark pit below me and to my left. The pit was purest black and so infinitely deep that it had no real depth at all. I was on the gurney with Dr. Wilson upside down above my head and the other nurses and doctors seemingly all clustered on my right side. Meanwhile, there was nothing on my left side except the blackness that I was getting drawn into. It exerted a pull that was slow but unanswerable, and I knew that if I went into the hole, I was never coming back. Wilson was still working on my neck, and I was feeling myself getting pulled more and more sternly into the darkness. And just when it seemed unavoidable, I became aware of something else. My father. He'd been dead 8 years, but there he was, not so much floating as simply existing above me and slightly to my left. Everything that had to do with life was on the right side of my body, and everything that had to do with this scary new place was on my left. My father exuded reassurance and seemed to be inviting me to go with him. It's okay. There's nothing to be scared of, he seemed to be saying. Don't fight it. I'll take care of you. I was enormously confused by his presence. My father had died at 89 and I loved him, but he had no business being there. Because I didn't know I was dying, his invitation to join him seemed grotesque. He was dead. I was alive, and I wanted nothing to do with him. In fact, I wanted nothing to do with the entire left side of the room. And I didn't understand why Dr. Wilson was taking so long to finish his work. Doctor, you got to hurry, I told him. You're losing me. I'm going right now. And that was the last thing I remembered for a very long time. So clearly he did survive. He wouldn't have been able to write that. So he did survive. But it's quite an incredible description of what he went through. And this leads him to investigate and talk to many people about near-death experiences. And he talks, one of the examples he gives is of the life review. I'll come back to this in a minute. The life review, he says, is one of the most powerful and comforting of visions that can occur in near-death experiences. It is characterized by the conviction that you have sweeping knowledge of all things and can simultaneously re-experience your entire life. And this is what one of the people he talked to said. When my expansion was over, I was everywhere. I was everything at the same time, this woman recalled. I was the sky. I was the ground. I was the trees, and I felt the wind blowing in my leaves. I was the sea, and I was also my parents, my friends, people I had not met before, but who at that point I knew because they were part of me. Very moving and incredible description, and the book is full of descriptions like that. I can't recommend the book too highly. So that's one particular book that I've been reading on near-death experiences. And a different, perhaps more academic, but still very interesting perspective on near-death experiences is given in one chapter in a book called Death, Immortality and Meaning in Life by John Martin Fisher. He's a professor of philosophy at the University of California. And this book emerged from a major project on the science, theology, and philosophy on immortality, and associated with that, immortality and meaningfulness in life, all sponsored by the John Templeton Foundation. And John Martin Fisher gives a very useful overview of near-death experiences and then gives his own view. So he says, near-death experiences are those had by people who find themselves in life-threatening situations. They're had by people maybe who are in cardiac arrest or under anesthesia or in comas. But unlike most people in those circumstances, those who have near-death experiences later report having had rich experiences during that time. Now, this is important because he says it's very difficult to get an estimate of how many people who go through near-death context actually have these experiences. But the best estimates seem to be 10 to 18% of people in near-death contexts report a near-death experience. Not everybody, by the way, reports positive near-death experiences. A small number report pretty horrifying experiences. But when we look at the more positive experiences, people often report seeing their own bodies receiving CPR or hearing the doctors talking about their operation or visiting with deceased relatives, in some cases, deceased relatives they never even knew they had. And the leading researcher on near-death experiences, Pim van Lommel, defines, therefore, near-death experiences as involving a range of impressions during a special state of consciousness, including a number of special elements such as an out-of-body experience, pleasant feelings, seeing a tunnel, a light, deceased relatives, maybe a life review, and a conscious return into the body. Now, John Martin Fisher also points out, interestingly, that what kind of experience you have relates to cultural factors where you live. So, for example, in Japan, some people who have near-death experiences report seeing themselves in a rock garden. Because it turns out in Japan, rather than the metaphor of light at the end of the tunnel, what people see relates to the idea of buying and tending a rock garden with one's family and friends in old age. So he's just reminding us the precise form that near-death experiences might take relate to your culture and what land you're living in. Now, when he reviews all these near-death experiences, I find it very interesting what he says. Is because he describes himself, as I'll explain shortly, a near-death experience realist. He writes that what he finds of particular significance is that in near-death experiences, there is a sense of a journey to another realm. And typically, on that journey, the person is guided or accompanied in that journey by a deceased loved one or by a loving religious figure. And he comments that such near-death experiences are deeply meaningful and transformative for the people who have them. They can lead to a complete reorientation of life's priorities. They seem to offer a glimpse not only into the nature of death, but also into the meaning of life. So when he finally gets to an evaluation of near-death experiences, John Martin Fisher adopts a middle way. He tends to the view that complete explanations of near-death experiences are to be found in multiple factors, some of which are physiological and others social and contextual. Nevertheless, he says, he really does believe that people have near-death experiences and the detailed contents that they report. He does not deny their experience. However, he is not convinced that the contents of their experiences are necessarily literally true descriptions of an external reality or of another external realm. But he does not entirely rule out the possibility. That's why he describes himself as a near-death experience realist. And the near-death realist, he says, can explain the awe-inspiring and transformative capacities of near-death experiences by reference to the stories that these experiences tell. He explains, the story near-death experiences tell is a story of loving kindness, guidance, in facing the most haunting part of our journey from life to death. We are not alone. So I think when I'm reading his writing, he's struggling to be a realist, but what pushes through is he's clearly incredibly moved by the accounts that he's been given, even if he's not convinced that near-death experiences are evidence of life after death. And I think that if you read Sebastian Junger's account, you will see that this tension is always there. Is there a physiological explanation of what happens, or is it indicative of something beyond our normal way of being? So you might, after hearing the discussions last week and this week, you might want to know my own position on rebirth and karma. And I'm an agnostic. I don't know what's going to happen after death. Though, as I will say at the end of this talk, I do have a leaning, a disposition in a particular direction. I'll come back to that. I'm intrigued by theories and accounts of what might happen after death of the physical body, though I'm not convinced that there is scientific proof of life after death. And I've not had meditative or other experiences such as dreams or visions or a near-death experience that convince me of the truth of rebirth and karma. So my intuitions are conflicted. I desire, like John Hick, who I talked about last week, that the universe is a just universe, but I have no proof of that. And I remember John Hick's comment to me, that might just be wishful thinking. But I am, of course, also open to the views of those teachers that I have great respect for, who clearly believe in the existence of rebirth. And my own teacher, Sangharakshita, the founder of our order and movement, has spoken about his belief in rebirth and how that has come about through personal experience. I appreciate his presentation of this issue and his careful sensitivity to those who find it difficult to believe in rebirth. And in a talk given in Sheffield in 2008, Sangharakshita reflected on what had led him from an early age to consistently follow the Dharma through his time growing up, in the army, and then wandering among Hindu teachers in India and afterwards. And he said this, sometimes I wonder, where did this tremendous urge come from? This urge which has played such a dominant part in my life for 60 years. I look back and think about the surroundings I was born into, very ordinary working class surroundings in Tooting, South London of all places. What is there to account for my interest? I can only presume that in all likelihood, some powerful samskara carried over from a previous existence had impelled me to follow a path that I had followed before, and then to reconnect with teachings and practices and experience with which I had been connected in previous lives. So he adds, as I've emphasized, my impression or conviction that I must have followed this path before does not in any way constitute a proof, much less a scientific proof, which might convince those who do not believe in the fact or idea of rebirth. And he goes on, other things influencing him, meeting persons who said they had past life memories, such as Dado Rinpoche and his friend Lama Govinda, as well as recalling his own important dream experiences. All of these added to his belief in rebirth. But Sangharakshita was very careful to call these experiences considerations, not proof, but considerations that explain his belief in rebirth. And in his conclusion, he says this: these are some of the considerations which have led me personally to accept the idea of rebirth. Of course, I am quite aware that for many Western Buddhists, belief in rebirth is a bit problematic. And he goes on, in the course of the last so many years, people have asked me whether it is possible to be a Buddhist and not believe in rebirth. My standard answer used to be, yes, you can be a Buddhist and not believe in rebirth. But as a Buddhist, you accept full enlightenment as the goal of the Buddha's teachings. If you don't believe in rebirth, you have to go all out for enlightenment in this very life. You have to sacrifice everything, give up everything. That is the only thing you can do, which is consistent with your belief in the Buddha as the enlightened one and your lack of belief in rebirth. Though, as we shall see, he qualifies that quite strong statement later in his comments. But he also points to a different danger in traditional Buddhist countries where belief in rebirth is widespread, where it's the natural thing. There is, however, he says, a real danger in many Buddhist countries that people put off the real practice of the Dharma to some future life. It is like an escape clause. They find it too difficult in this life, so they will do it in another life under more favorable circumstances. In some Theravada countries, many people believe that. They aim to be reborn when a Buddha is alive, so they can hear the Dharma directly from him, and it will be much easier to gain enlightenment. They don't care much about actual practice of the Dharma in this life. They just aim to be reborn when Maitreya Buddha is around. Of course, he says, that is a cop-out. Very strongly, that is a cop-out. And he concludes, the best method for us is to follow a middle way, to do our best to progress spiritually as best we can in this life, but not be too tense, believing that we have either got to do it now or never, and perhaps to die, as it were, unfulfilled. If people have the possibility of rebirth at the back of their minds, that can relieve the tension, but they should not, like some Eastern Buddhists, attach so much importance to rebirth and future possibilities of treading the path to enlightenment that they forget or neglect to do so in this life. So my tentative conclusion, again, I am open to what may or may not happen after death of my body. If I have a leaning, if you like, a disposition, it is that something of me will continue after death. That's an intuition. I can't back that up with any evidence. And I'll explain more about that in the 6th and final talk in the series. Not next week, but in 2 weeks' time. So I'll leave it there tonight.
Thank you very much, Vaddhaka, for another eloquent and very articulate and thought-provoking talk on the theme. Very interesting themes you brought up there. I think we do have a bit of time for maybe 2 or 3 questions. If anyone wants to ask Vaddhaka anything about his talk? Obviously, we'll be having discussion groups after the tea break, but if you've got a pressing question that you'd like to ask Vaddhaka now, we've got a little bit of time to open the floor to Vaddhaka.
The near-death experiences that you described don't resemble the process of dying that Padmasambhava described.
You mean in the Tibetan Book of the Dead?
Yes. So I just wondered, you know, why is it people have these common experiences of tunnels and light and relatives, etc., whereas Padmasambhava describes a process of the loss of the elements and this sort of consciousness expanding experience where
But there is the
mind
clear light.
disappears. But not relatives and comforting things that one
No,
might
but maybe
believe in.
we're talking, okay. So I'm giving a talk on this at Parinirvana
Yeah.
Day. And there's some very, I think there's a context in this, which is a very Tibetan context, cultural and practice context to the descriptions of what happens. So simply what the process of dying is described in the Tibetan Book of the Dead in relation to the elements departing. And that's what they call the outer dissolution. And then you enter this moment where the clear light, boom, emerges. Now you might relate that to the tunnel and the light at the end of the tunnel, something similar. Now what happens after that relates very much to the context and the teachings of the mandala of the five Buddhas. It goes through all sorts of different things and so on. So it's very culturally specific. And we are going to be influenced by our own culture and our own upbringing. So as I said, like that example in Japan, where it's people enter a rock garden, it's very different. And I remember watching a film a long time ago at Padmaloka with Surata, and he wanted to watch it, and it was about Native American Indians, actually in northern Canada, and a Roman Catholic who's trying to convert them. And one of them is dying, and it has this process of him dying and the visions that he goes through. And of course, the visions that he goes through relate exactly to Indian culture and expectations and so on. So they're going to differ dramatically according to culture and so on. But of course, if you throw yourself completely into the Tibetan, into the Bardo Tadal and follow that practice time after time after time, maybe that's what happens for you. But we should not expect that that necessarily happens to us in the West. It'll be much more culturally specific, relating to personal circumstances and the spiritual practices that we've been doing. And we can talk, I'll talk more about them in the talk on the Tibetan Book of the Dead in Parinirvana Day.
Look forward to it.
Yeah.
I was just going to do a supplementary to that. Someone was in contact with me recently, and sort of someone very close to her had died, and she wanted to do some practices for the 49th day, which is part of the Tibetan Bardo Tadal practices, but wanting to do it with her relatives and things like that, and you know, some rituals around that. And I said possibly it wouldn't be appropriate. We, you know, culturally we don't have that, but you can use the premise of the Tibetan Book of the Dead is to talk to the person,
Yes,
and to reassure them, and you know, you can encourage them to move towards love, move towards light, be free. So even though we mightn't have, and honestly I hope I don't have all those experiences from the Tibetan Book of the Dead, we can talk to people who are, you know, the premise is that you can talk to people who have died and encourage them and support them in that way through metta, but also through hearing, to move towards whatever might be a more open state.
No, I agree, absolutely. I think that's very powerful. I think I've said before that, you know, I was brought up in a scientific materialist world. I was a Marxist and so on, and all this rubbish about afterlife and so on. And then I found myself very soon after learning the Metta Bhavana sending metta to my dead parents. And I was convinced that they got it, and it mattered. And you can just, you have to sort of get a sense of people's limitations, but actually sending metta, praying for their well-being and so on, wishing them well, remembering them. All of those things matter. So, yeah, but actually, you know, you don't have to go through the exact 49 days, etc.
Yeah.
In the research that one of the people did about all the near-death experiences, I can't remember his name. Yeah, I wonder if there's any reference to dreams, dream life, interpretation of dreams and stuff like that.
Not that I'm aware of. No, not that I'm aware of. Because I mean, Sangharakshita put great stress on his dreams relating to a belief in an afterlife, in rebirth. So, and of course, one of the bardos in the Bardo Tadol in the Tibetan Book of the Dead is the bardo of dreams. And that's seen as being very important in the Tibetan spiritual practices, being able to do dream yoga and so on. You're actually practicing, if you like, for what might happen when you die. So dreams certainly seem to figure very prominently in the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And certainly other people have had visions, and people will talk about these things in dreams that are very, very life transformative for them. But I don't think there's any specific mention of dreams in Sebastian Unger's book. And I don't know, and don't think there is in John Martin Fisher's book, not the ones that I've read. But a book that does talk about dreams is a book by Evan Thompson called Waking Dreaming Being, which does cover dreams. Yeah.
I think we've got time for maybe one more question, if there's anyone wants to.
Yeah.
Did you have a moment during your lovely research where you felt that it really really moved you in a heart way? Did you have a moment where you just thought, oh, that's what you personally were looking for?
Well, when the excerpt that I read of the woman describing to Sebastian Unger that moment where she becomes one with everything, and she describes it, whoa, very, very powerful. Very powerful indeed.
Okay, well, thanks very much for your questions. Do you want to say anything about the discussion?
I think I've given you 3 areas there to think about. Tulkus, what do you think about the phenomenon of tulkus, reincarnate lamas? What do you think about proof or otherwise for life after death, for rebirth, and near-death experiences? You've got plenty of areas to explore there. And maybe you have some personal things that relate to those areas that you can share if you're willing in the discussion groups. Yep.
Thanks very much, Vaddhaka. So we'll break for tea. We'll just get Vaddhaka.